Hello everyone. Today I want to continue reading for you my book, Breathing for Confidence. It is the first book in my series, Your Voice, Your Superpower. And it is where I start all my students who study with me for voice or singing. So we always start with breathing. Okay? So this is chapter 1, Anxiety Overload. And as always, all the chapters have a little quote, and this one is no different. So the quote for this one is, "Our lives begin and end with a breath." And that quote is from me, Angelina Kalahari. Although I'm sure many people have said it, but this is what I tell my students at the start of our lessons together. Jake Tyler had been thinking about the most important audition of his life for months. But now it was here, the sameness of the day was disappointing in every way. Surely something should be different. Shouldn't there be a sense of wonderment? But there was nothing new, only the usual rush from one venue to another. When the train pulled into Canary Wharf's tube station, Jake could barely wait for the doors to open. Cooler air washed over him as he ran for the exit. But too many people were heading for the escalators, so Jake ran up the stairs 2 at a time. His heart drummed in his ears by the time he reached the concourse, but more stairs to the street forced him to renew his efforts. He had made a mental map of where he was supposed to go, but now he was in the street and being unfamiliar with this part of London, he was unsure of the location. Snatching his phone from his jeans back pocket, he noticed his hands were shaking, but he ignored the panic rising in his chest. He Googled the venue and raced in the direction where the auditions were being held. The packet of vocal zones that had attached itself to his phone reminded him to take another. Hopefully, it would help to keep his voice warm, or at least clear. The building was nondescript, but he found it without trouble. He checked the time. It was 3:05. He was 5 minutes late. Why had the rehearsal overrun today of all days, and why were there always delays on the tube when he had to be on time somewhere important? He lengthened his strides through the door and immediately stepped into an air-conditioned reception. The cold air was a relief on his body, but he wondered what it would do to his voice. At the reception desk, he fumbled inside his rucksack. With a clammy hand, he produced the already crumpled letter that confirmed his attendance. Shortly after the receptionist had ticked his name on her list, a guy dressed in black with a red logo on his top from the TV show The Singer and a clipboard in his hand came to collect Jake and his fellow auditionees. Despite having sucked on several vocal zones, Jake could feel his voice was no longer warm. The realization caused more sweat to break out on his body, and he exhaled slowly through pursed lips to reduce his heart's renewed galloping beat. He tracked down a guy in black and asked if he had time to go to the loo. "Yes, but you can't sing in there." Damn! If he couldn't sing, how was he to warm up his voice? As he walked to the toilet, he started to hum gently and low so he wouldn't disturb anyone. Any warm-up was better than none. Once there, he continued to hum, washed his hands and face, and prayed he could embody the song he'd chosen, Feeling Good, one of his favourites. But before long, other people came in and Jake was forced to leave. He walked back as slowly as he could, continuing to hum and deliberately slowing his breathing. When he got back to his seat, he realized he'd be called soon, as there were only a few people ahead of him. That went fast, perhaps too fast. Should he be relieved or panicked? What did it mean? Perhaps they just hadn't found the right person they liked yet. He sighed and attempted to stop jiggling his leg. When the guy in black touched Jake's shoulder to alert him to his audition, he could feel his breathing was still too high in his body. He fought without success for control over it as he followed the man. The audition room was a small theatre. Jake wanted to feel comforted by it, but standing in the wings, as he had done on so many occasions for so many West End shows, an overwhelming feeling of panic flooded through his body. It fastened itself on his nervous system, threatening to devour him entirely. His knees suddenly felt as though they couldn't carry him forward even one step. The feeling was paralyzing. He'd experienced nothing like it before, not even when he'd walked out on the massive stage of the Apollo Victoria Theatre 6 months ago on his first night in the role of Fiyero that he was understudying in Wicked. Jake tried to swallow, but his mouth was drier than the dusty floor beneath his feet. He took a quick sip from the bottle of water he'd brought with him and swirled it around his mouth before swallowing it. But it still felt like ice going down his throat. He'd had to grab the bottle from the fridge in a small newsagent's on the way here. It was all there was in the little shop. Talking himself down from his anxiety about this being the most important audition of his life was futile. But he desperately didn't want to mess up the audition. His entire future depended on it. When they called his name, he had to fight with his body to move forward. Fortunately, his years of theatre training came to his rescue. Jake walked onto the stage, looked at the producers, smiled, waved to them, and went to stand on the X marked on the floor. The cameraman manipulating the large television camera in his direction didn't escape his notice. Its little red light was on, showing recording had already begun. Too soon, the sound guy to whom Jake had given his USB stick with a backing track signalled to ask if Jake was ready. He nodded, took a deep breath, and waited for the music to lead him to the note where his voice would join it. But when he started to sing, he could feel his voice was heavy, and his breathing wouldn't work. It was too high in his chest. He felt as though he might strangle himself. His voice sounded weak and uncontrolled to his ears. Jake tried everything he'd learned over the years to regulate his breathing and to bend his voice to his will. But nothing he did worked. Before he could rescue himself, the producer held up his hand to stop Jake. His audition had lasted all of 3 minutes. Even as he left the stage, he knew he wouldn't be called back. His heart felt as though it had turned into cement. An overwhelming sense of defeat and rejection threatened to floor him and hammered against his gut as though someone was playing a full set of drums in there, forcing him to deal with the resultant nausea. He thought, not for the first time, what made it worse was that these types of auditions were always judged by non-performers, non-singers, people who had no idea what it took to do what he did. No vocal coaches or singing teachers were ever part of such panels. He was thoroughly sick of jumping through hoops for suits. But perhaps today it was a good thing there were no singers or voice coaches on the panel. The reception area brimmed with a bunch of new auditionees, and Jake had to fight his way to the revolving door. He left the building. He'd never been lower. His feet were lead, and the tube station seemed inordinately far away. He felt completely broken. His dreams of being an internationally famous singer seemed as distant as the nearest star was from our solar system, and as unreachable. The vision in his mind's eye of performing in arenas all over the world now seemed an impossible dream. He'd imagined making great, innovative and funky videos for each track, rehearsing imaginary interviews with famous talk show and podcast hosts, and being featured on the cover of Rolling Stone magazine, felt as though he could touch his dream. But now it was over. Yet his heart wouldn't let it go. As he reached the tube station, a text on his phone alerted him to the audition Martin had arranged. Jake checked the time. It was just after 3:30. Another audition was the last thing he felt like doing right now. What he wanted most was to go home, lie down on his bed and curl into a fetal position. But he was a professional performer. It was all he knew how to do. All the blood, sweat and tears and years of training had to be for something. He couldn't imagine doing anything else. Could he be satisfied to work where and when he could, just as most of his friends did? He had no choice. He had to get to the next audition. Jake knew he had to hurry, but his legs wouldn't move. In truth, he couldn't imagine spending the rest of his life going from one musical to the next. This audition had been his only shot at breaking away from the West End, his chance to become what he'd dreamed of for so long. This audition had been the entry to his dream. He braced himself and forced his body through the tube station's entrance to battle with the crowds once again. Arriving at his destination in the West End 45 minutes later, Jake realised he needed an energy booster before he could attend the next audition. He was almost too tired to think, never mind sing again. Instead, he tried to muster up the connection to the here and now to remember which foods and drinks were most threatened good vocal production and should be avoided at all costs. But he couldn't face food right now, and went into a nearby coffee shop to order a decaffeinated coffee with honey. Coffee was probably not the right thing to drink, but he didn't care. At least it was warm, decaffeinated, and contained honey. It would do. Jake entered the theatre to be surrounded by enthusiastic singers and performers getting ready for their auditions. The air around them was effervescent with hopeful anxiety, anticipation, and gorgeous warmed-up voices. On the stairs, people were trilling their way through scales and stretching through yoga and Pilates poses to keep their bodies and voices warm. It made him want to run away, but he saw a few faces he knew and liked. When he recognised Scott's tall figure walking towards him, Jake smiled, even though his stomach still felt queasy from his earlier failure. Jake liked that he and Scott stood out because they were both unusually taller than most people around them. Jake felt a sense of reassurance that they had attended the same drama school and studied with the same voice and singing teachers for years. But he was grateful they were never in competition with each other. Thankfully, different roles and characters demanded Scott's beautiful baritone and didn't suit Jake's high tenor voice. Scott waved, smiled, and walked towards Jake. "Hey, I wondered when you'd get here. You'll ace this audition." But as with all good friends, it wasn't long before Scott realised something was amiss with Jake. Scott lowered his voice so no one else could hear. He bent his blonde head closer to Jake's dark one. "What's wrong?" Jake didn't trust himself to speak. He sighed and sat down on the stairs. When Scott sat down beside him, Scott's slim shoulder against Jake's more muscular one, he spoke. "I just auditioned for the singer." Scott's eyes widened. "You mean the TV show?" Jake nodded. Scott clapped a dramatic hand to his cheek. "Oh my God, how exciting!" Immediately, Scott narrowed his eyes. "But I can see it didn't go well. You don't seem excited." "No. I messed up, man, big time. I had to rush to get there because the rehearsal for Wicked overran. Again. Then I panicked and screwed up my breathing. What made it worse was I couldn't even warm up my voice there. By the time I got there, I could feel my voice wasn't warm anymore, and the water I'd bought was too cold and further screwed up my voice. It was a bloody nightmare." Scott placed a sympathetic hand on Jake's forearm. "I'm sure it's not that bad. Even on your worst days, you sing like an angel. We all envy you that ability, you must know." Jake appreciated Scott's attempt at making light of the matter. But when he didn't respond, Scott continued. "Look at you. With your dark hair, blue eyes, and the body of a god. When things like looks and talent were dished out, you were obviously at the front of the queue. But you stood at the back when objectivity about yourself was on offer. Jake smiled, despite himself. He knew Scott enjoyed flirting with him, even though Scott knew Jake was straight. They respected each other's talent and commitment to the arts and creativity. Apart from that, their easy compatibility was the reason they'd remained such good friends over the years. Scott immediately wanted to know the details. Jake stalled. How could he tell Scott what had happened without making himself look like a complete idiot? But vulnerability was one thing all performers had in common, and Jake knew Scott wouldn't judge him. Hadn't he always been there when Scott had had his streaks of bad luck? But this was different. This was about Jake's treasured dream to become an international superstar, and Scott knew it. Jake knew Scott would understand why he hadn't told anyone about auditioning for the singer. He didn't want any negative influences to stop him. But Scott wasn't going away. He was sitting close to Jake and staring at him, expectancy bright in his hazel eyes. Reluctantly, Jake told Scott what had happened. Scott listened and nodded, but waited until Jake had finished before he responded. But I don't know why you feel so down about it, Jake. You're still young. If you feel you failed, why don't you prepare and try again next year? But I'll be 25 then. So? Wasn't one contestant in her 30s when she won? I think it was the first one. Yes, but she didn't succeed, did she? She was dropped after her debut single flopped. Jake's knowing smile spread wider. Oh, I hadn't realised you'd been checking up on the previous winners. There were a few older ones, and they're still going. I think there were only 2 under 25. Well, now who's looking at the winners? A sudden disturbance behind them pulled them out of their private chat. The volume in the room dropped by several decibels as people huddled together in whispered conversations. Jake and Scott got up and took long strides to the group of singers they knew. Scott sat down and asked what they both wanted to know. Hey guys, what's happening? Pretty Mandy, as everyone called her, shook her blonde hair and indicated with big blue eyes to the right. Jake and Scott knew not to look directly where she'd indicated and faked disinterest, instead continuing to look at her for an answer. Mandy's voice couldn't disguise her excitement. Vince has just arrived. Jake and Scott glanced at each other. Everyone knew Vince Pollard came from a well-established family in the industry. His mere presence caused thrills in men and women alike. Not only did he look like a god with his blonde hair, magnificent abs and shoulders, straight white teeth and dimples, but he also sang like one. Jake and Scott's eyes conveyed the same message that said, what is the point of any other tenors trying to audition for a role that would inevitably go to Vince? Jake could read the sympathy in Scott's eyes as Scott gave him a friendly thump on the shoulder, his voice a whisper. You don't want to understudy him again in this show, do you? Jake shrugged, as if to say, what choice do I have? Scott nudged his friend. Your time will come. But I thought you still had 6 months on your contract for Wicked. Yes, I do, but I think Martin is right. It's time to look around for another show before my contract ends. It's probably what Vince is doing here too. Scott nodded, his eyes thoughtful. It's great you have such a brilliant agent working for you. I'd love to be represented by Martin. You never told me how you wrangled it. Jake scratched his chin and contemplated his best friend. Are you hinting I should arrange an audition for you with Martin? Scott leaned closer so the others wouldn't hear. I'll share my secret weapon with you if you can get me an audition with Martin. Jake laughed, but wondered why Scott would want to change agents. He'd forgotten who represented Scott, but his auditions were almost always successful. But you must have an amazing agent. You're everywhere I am, and you almost always get the roles you go for. Scott tapped his nose conspiratorially. But it's not because of an agent. No? What then? It's my singing coach. She's the best. Jake leant back and sighed. I haven't been to a vocal coach in ages. Maybe that's what my problem is. I think I need to brush up on some of my techniques, especially breathing. Scott lifted an eyebrow at his friend. I had no idea you weren't attending regular lessons anymore. I couldn't do this job without it. But I know some singers could only see a vocal coach when they have a new job coming up. I can't do it. I think I'm too much of a control freak. Jake smiled. You and me both. Control freaks, I mean. I see a vocal coach, but not regularly. And now you mention it, I think I should do so again. In that case, you must see Anne. She's strict and you must work hard. But if anyone can get you back on track quickly, she can. She has this weird idea that commitment to technique and practice increases your chances of success. Jake laughed and pretended to have his arm twisted behind his back. Okay. I'll text Martin about you right now if you'll share her details. But just as Jake was about to message Martin, his phone dinged as a text from Martin appeared. We need to talk. It didn't bode well. Jake excused himself, got up, walked down the stairs and out of the stage door to make the call to Martin. Martin's voice sounded pinched and severe. It set off alarm bells in Jake's mind. Thank you for listening. Until next time.